3 days after I gave birth to my twins, the mother of my husband showed up in my hospital room. She did not come alone. She brought my husband his mistress and a set of divorce papers. She threw a check for $12 million on my bed and told me to sign away my custody rights. She said she only wanted the kids and that I could take the money and disappear. So I did exactly what she asked. I signed the papers and vanished that very night. But by morning, she realized that trying to buy out a forensic accountant was the biggest financial mistake of her life. Before I tell you how I balanced her family fortune to zero, tell me where you are watching from in the comments. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to teach a toxic family member a lesson they will never forget. The pain from my emergency surgery was still sharp when the door to my recovery room swung open. I had barely slept in 3 days. I was exhausted, bleeding, and trying to recover while my newborn twins slept in the nursery down the hall. I looked up expecting a nurse. Instead, Joyce marched into the room. Right behind her was Marcus, my husband of 4 years, and clinging to his arm was Chloe. Chloe was a wealthy heiress who had been lingering around Marcus for months. I noticed immediately that Chloe was wearing the custom cream cashmere sweater I had packed in my hospital bag. She pulled it tighter around her shoulders and offered me a sickeningly sweet smile. I did not scream. I did not cry. I just watched as Joyce stepped up to the edge of my bed. She dropped a thick brown folder onto my lap, followed by a certified bank check. "Take the $12 million and sign the papers," Joyce demanded. Her voice was ice cold, carrying that same tone of superiority she had used against me since the day Marcus introduced us. I picked up the check. It was drawn directly from their family trust fund. $12 million. A fortune by any standard. I slowly looked at Marcus. He could not even meet my eyes. He stared at the blank hospital wall instead. "You are a smart girl." Maya Joyce continued pacing beside the bed. "We all know why you married into this family. You come from nothing. You spend half your paycheck taking care of your parents in that run-down neighborhood. You are drowning in debt, always trying to save your poor relatives. Marcus needs a wife with real generational wealth. Someone who understands our social standing. Someone like Chloe." I turned my gaze to my husband. "Marcus," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level, "is this what you want?" He finally looked at me. His expression was completely void of the love he had promised me at the altar. "You are brilliant, Maya," he stated clinically. "You have great genetics. You are the perfect incubator to give me healthy heirs. But you do not fit into my world. You never did. You embarrass my mother at her country club events. Chloe is the woman I want to stand beside me. You get $12 million to walk away and start fresh. It is more money than you could ever make crunching numbers at your forensic accounting firm. Just sign the custody surrender. We take the twins and you go back to where you came from." Chloe let out a soft laugh and leaned her head against the shoulder of my husband. "Just take the money, Maya," she sneered. "We all know you gold diggers only care about the payout anyway. Do not make this harder than it needs to be." I looked down at the documents. The custody surrender agreement was standard. It was drafted by their expensive family lawyers. It stated that by accepting the enclosed funds, I forfeited all parental rights to the twins. Joyce tapped her designer fingernail impatiently against the metal bed frame. "We do not have all day," she snapped. "Sign it. Take your payday and get out of our lives." My heart hammered against my ribs, but my hands remained perfectly steady. I did not shed a single tear for the man standing in front of me. I reached over to the bedside table, picked up a heavy black pen, and pulled the documents toward me. I flipped to the last page. I signed my name in smooth, bold strokes. I handed the folder to Joyce and folded the check into my palm. A triumphant smile spread across the face of my enemy. She snatched the folder and turned. "Let us go, Marcus," she instructed. "The incubator has been paid." Marcus wrapped his arm around the waist of Chloe, and the three of them walked out of my hospital room, leaving me alone with my physical pain and a $12 million check. They thought they won. They thought they had successfully purchased my flesh and blood and tossed me aside like garbage. They had no idea who they were dealing with. When the door shut, the helpless victim facade vanished. I sat up, ignoring my burning abdomen. I pressed the red call button attached to my bed rail. When the nurse answered the intercom, my voice was razor sharp. "Send security to my room immediately," I commanded. I picked up my phone and dialed a private number. A familiar, calm voice answered on the first ring. "It is Maya," I said, staring at the check in my hand. "I need a secure, untraceable line to the offshore bank. We are initiating the protocol right now." The time for playing the obedient wife was officially over forever. Joyce wanted a war over my children and my future. She was about to learn that numbers never lie, and I knew exactly how to make her lose it all. Across town, the Sterling mansion buzzed with the clinking of crystal. The massive crystal chandelier cast a warm glow over the expensive marble floors. Every detail in the house was perfectly designed to impress their wealthy guests. Marcus poured a vintage champagne, handing a flute to Chloe as she spun around the freshly painted nursery. The room was a sickening display of excessive wealth, draped in imported silk and filled with custom toys my children would supposedly play with under her supervision. Chloe traced her fingers over a mahogany crib, laughing about how easily they had handled the situation. She boasted to Marcus that buying out a working-class girl from the South Side was cheaper than buying a decent yacht. Marcus chuckled, adjusting his designer watch, completely unbothered by the fact that he had just abandoned his newborn children and his wife bleeding in a recovery ward. He told Chloe my entire purpose was fulfilled the moment those twins took their first breath. In his mind, his family had simply completed a business transaction. They had acquired the healthy genetics of a smart black woman while securing a socially acceptable white heiress to raise them for the country club cameras. They drank to their flawless victory, entirely oblivious to the silent digital war I was waging from my hospital bed. I pulled my encrypted laptop from the hidden compartment of my overnight bag. The physical pain in my abdomen flared wildly, but absolute adrenaline kept my hands perfectly steady. Marcus always joked to his wealthy friends that my job as a forensic accountant was just glorified bookkeeping for poor people. He never realized that my security clearance levels allowed me to see every hidden shell company, every offshore account, and every fraudulent wire transfer the Sterling family had executed. Over the past 5 years, I had actually discovered his affair with Chloe 6 months ago during a routine audit of his firm expense reports. Instead of crying or confronting him, I had started building my exit strategy in total secrecy. I logged into the primary Sterling Legacy Trust portal, right there in the dark hospital room. The $12 million Joyce had used to buy my children was sitting there, a massive pool of stolen funds they had siphoned from minority business contracts. With a few rapid keystrokes, I bypassed their ridiculously rudimentary two-factor authentication process. I initiated a complex series of rapid microtransfers. I bounced the massive funds through 7 different international banking servers before funneling the entire $12 million into an untraceable account under a dummy corporation I had strategically set up in Delaware. The laptop screen blinked green. Transaction fully complete. The untouchable Sterling Family Trust Fund was now completely empty. I closed the laptop just as the heavy wooden door to my room opened quietly. 4 massive men wearing dark tailored suits stepped inside the room. This was the elite private security team I had hired months ago, paid for with the silent consulting fees I earned catching corporate embezzlers for federal agencies. The lead security officer nodded respectfully, handing me a heavy winter coat to hide my medical garments. I ignored the agonizing pull of my stitches as I stood up from the bed. We walked swiftly down the sterile white hospital hallway directly to the neonatal nursery. The night shift nurse, whom I had generously compensated earlier that evening, handed me my beautiful sleeping twins without asking a single question. I secured them tightly against my chest in a comfortable double carrier. We bypassed the brightly lit main lobby, entirely taking the restricted service elevator down to the underground loading dock. A black armored sport utility vehicle sat idling in the dark shadows as the security team gently helped me into the spacious back seat. I looked up at the towering hospital building one last time. Joyce and Marcus expected me to be a broken, weeping mess, incredibly grateful for their financial scraps. They genuinely thought my silence during their cruel hospital visit was an act of submission. They were about to learn it was merely the calm before a calculated tactical strike. The morning sun hit the pristine diamond display cases at the jewelry boutique with blinding brilliance. Joyce stood confidently at the very important person counter, sipping a tiny espresso and pointing an impeccably manicured finger at a massive diamond tennis necklace. She told the attentive jeweler it was a lavish push, present for her future daughter-in-law. She loudly bragged to the other wealthy patrons in the store about how she had successfully secured her family lineage from an unworthy mother. She arrogantly handed over the heavy black metal wealth card connected directly to the Sterling Legacy Trust. The jeweler smiled warmly, running the prestigious card through the payment terminal. The machine beeped, emitting a remarkably sharp and unpleasant sound. The jeweler frowned in utter confusion, offering a quick apology, and ran the metal card again. The exact same harsh beep echoed loudly through the quiet luxury boutique. Joyce slammed her hand hard on the glass counter aggressively, demanding the store manager and insisting there must be a ridiculous glitch with their inferior payment machine. The manager arrived quickly, looking incredibly pale and deeply uncomfortable. He held a cordless phone out to her nervously, explaining that her private wealth banker was on the line with a highly urgent message. Joyce snatched the receiver aggressively, her face turning a deep crimson with rage as she demanded an immediate explanation for the embarrassing decline. The voice on the other end delivered a message that made the color completely drain from her arrogant face. The senior banker took a deep breath before delivering the final devastating blow. He politely informed her that there was absolutely no system glitch on their end today. The exclusive Black Wealth card was permanently declined because the $12 million family trust account had been entirely liquidated during the night. The phone slipped from the trembling hand of Joyce and clattered heavily against the pristine glass display case of the luxury boutique. The words of the senior banker echoed in her mind, completely shattering her reality. The money was gone. Every single cent of the Sterling Legacy Trust had vanished into thin air. She did not bother apologizing to the bewildered jeweler or the gaping wealthy patrons she had just been boasting to. She snatched her useless metal wealth card and practically ran out of the boutique, dialing Marcus with shaking fingers. When he finally answered, his voice was thick with sleep and celebration champagne. She screamed into the receiver, ignoring the stares of pedestrians on the sidewalk, demanding he get dressed immediately. The incubator did not just take the money, she shrieked. She took everything. Marcus and Joyce tore through the hospital lobby, entirely ignoring the front desk staff shouting after them to sign in. They shoved their way onto the elevator, their faces flushed with absolute rage and rising panic. Marcus was already composing the narrative in his head, planning exactly how he would destroy Maya in court for grand larceny. They burst through the heavy wooden door of the recovery room, ready to unleash hell and demand answers. The room was completely empty. The hospital bed was meticulously made. The expensive floral arrangements Marcus had guilt-purchased were gone. The only thing remaining was a single manila folder resting perfectly in the center of the pristine white mattress. Joyce lunged for it, ripping it open with her manicured claws. It was not the original custody surrender document they had forced Maya to sign. It was a high-quality photocopy, and scrawled across the bottom in bright red ink was a single mocking, smiling face. Marcus roared in frustration, violently kicking a heavy metal bedside tray table across the room. He pulled out his phone and dialed emergency services, screaming at the dispatcher that his mentally unstable postpartum wife had just kidnapped his newborn heirs and stolen millions of dollars. 2 uniformed police officers arrived within 10 minutes, stepping into a scene of complete hysteria. Joyce was weeping dramatically into a tissue, playing the role of the devastated, loving grandmother to absolute perfection. Marcus paced the linoleum floor furiously, showing the officers photos of the twins on his phone and demanding they issue an Amber Alert immediately. He painted Maya as a dangerous gold-digging opportunist who had suffered a massive psychotic break, willingly signed away her parental rights, and then stolen their family fortune in a fit of delusion. He insisted she was a flight risk and a danger to his children. The taller officer pulled out his notepad, his expression serious, as he asked for vehicle descriptions, license plate numbers, and last known locations. Before Marcus could answer, his cell phone vibrated violently in his pocket. The caller identification flashed the name of the most notoriously ruthless family law attorney in the city, Evelyn Vance. Thinking this was the perfect opportunity to prove the guilt of his wife and catch her in a lie, Marcus answered the call and immediately pressed the speakerphone button, holding the device out for the officers to hear. He demanded to know where his children were and threatened to have Evelyn disbarred for aiding a fugitive. A sharp, humorless laugh echoed through the small speaker. Evelyn did not sound intimidated. She sounded victorious. "You seem incredibly confused about who holds the power in this dynamic," Marcus Evelyn stated crisply. "My client is currently resting safely at an undisclosed, highly secure location with her children. And before you waste another second of taxpayer money, those officers standing next to you need to know that you have absolutely zero legal claim to those babies." Marcus scoffed loudly, pointing at the photocopy on the bed, as if the lawyer could see it. He yelled that he had a signed legally binding contract proving she surrendered full custody just yesterday. Evelyn did not miss a beat. She calmly explained that a contract signed by a woman actively bleeding from a major surgical procedure, heavily medicated with strong narcotics, and actively under severe emotional duress is entirely void. It is not worth the paper it is printed on. Any judge in the country would throw it out and penalize him heavily for coercion. Joyce stepped closer to the phone, her voice shaking with venom. She screamed that Maya was still a criminal, a common thief who had illegally drained their private trust fund in the middle of the night. Evelyn sighed loudly, the sound dripping with extreme condescension. She corrected Joyce immediately. Maya did not steal anything. As a certified forensic accountant, Maya had been quietly auditing his investment firm for the past 2 years, working late nights while Marcus was busy wining and dining Chloe. She discovered that Marcus had been hiding massive corporate losses, terrible real estate investments, and lavish gifts for his mistresses by funneling fake consulting fees into a shell corporation to avoid declaring bankruptcy and losing his country club status. Marcus thought he was a brilliant financial mastermind playing the system. He never realized Maya actually owned that exact shell corporation, having set it up before they were even married. The $12 million was not a generous payout for the twins, nor was it stolen. It was the precise amount of legally binding corporate debt Marcus owed her company, verified by his own fraudulent ledgers. Maya simply collected her overdue invoices using the access codes he had carelessly left on his unsecured home computer. The silence in the hospital room was absolute. Marcus stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. The color rapidly drained from his face as the crushing weight of his own financial crimes crashed down on him. His mother stared at him in horror, suddenly realizing her son was not a successful self-made businessman, but a desperate fraud who had just cost her the entire family fortune. He slowly lowered the phone, his hands shaking violently as he turned his desperate gaze toward the 2 police officers. He fully expected them to somehow intervene on his behalf to arrest his wife, to fix the monumental disaster he had created. Instead, the taller officer snapped his notepad shut and signaled to his partner. The second officer stepped forward, reaching into his heavy tactical vest. He did not pull out a 2-way radio to issue an Amber Alert. He pulled out a thick stack of aggressively folded legal documents and shoved them directly into the chest of my husband. The officer announced that he was officially serving Marcus with an emergency domestic restraining order, barring him from coming within 1,000 feet of Maya or the twins. He then handed over a second, even thicker envelope informing a completely shattered Marcus that he was being officially subpoenaed by federal authorities for extensive corporate fraud and extreme tax evasion. The heavy oak door of my safe house vibrated under violent pounding. I stood in the kitchen staring at the security monitor. My twin babies were sleeping soundly upstairs, oblivious to the chaos outside. The screen displayed the furious faces of Sarah and her husband Bradley. Sarah was the younger sister of Marcus, a woman who had spent her life coasting on the Sterling family name. Beside her stood Bradley, a man whose arrogance matched his profound incompetence. He wore a tailored navy suit vibrating with aggressive energy as he slammed his fist against the steel door. My lead security contractor stepped into the kitchen alert. He informed me they had aggressively tailgated a delivery vehicle through the outer gate and asked if I wanted them forcibly removed. I shook my head. I told the guard to stand down but stay close. Running from bullies only gave them false power. I walked to the front door and pulled it open, flanked by two towering security professionals. Sarah lunged forward the moment the door swung inward. Her face twisted into an ugly snarl, her designer handbag swinging wildly as she attempted to push into my home. The security guards easily blocked her path, their massive frames forming an impenetrable wall. Bradley quickly grabbed the arm of his wife, pulling her back slightly, but his eyes glared at me with pure venom. He puffed out his chest, attempting to use his physical height to intimidate me. He demanded I call off my guard dogs and let them inside immediately. He claimed they were there to handle a family crisis I had maliciously created. I stood my ground with a blank expression. I informed them they had exactly 3 minutes to state their business before I had them arrested for criminal trespassing. Bradley scoffed loudly in disbelief. He adjusted the cuffs of his expensive custom shirt and leaned forward, invading my personal space. He told me I was playing a very dangerous game with people who possessed infinitely more resources than a glorified bookkeeper from a poor neighborhood. He bragged his elite investment firm managed billions of dollars in assets for the most powerful families. He threatened to use every ounce of his financial influence to completely destroy my life. He promised to freeze all my bank accounts, tie me up in endless litigation, and ensure I would never work in the financial sector again. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. He ordered me to wire the $12 million back into the Sterling Trust account immediately, or he would personally see to it that my parents lost their house and my career was ruined. Sarah nodded vigorously behind him, a smug smile spreading across her face. She called me a pathetic thief and declared I was exactly the trashy gold digger her mother warned them about. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice or defend my working-class background. I simply turned my back on them and walked over to the kitchen island. I opened my heavily encrypted work laptop, letting the biometric scanner verify my identity, and woke the vibrant high-resolution screen from its completely dormant sleep mode. Bradley marched confidently up to the threshold of the open doorway, believing his aggressive threats had successfully broken my spirit. He obnoxiously boasted that I was finally making a smart, highly logical decision for once in my entire life. He dictated routing numbers, expecting me to blindly follow his commands and transfer the fortune back to his disgraced family. I typed a highly secure password into a hidden financial database and pulled up a specific, heavily detailed dossier. I turned the laptop around so the bright screen faced the open doorway. I calmly invited Bradley to step closer and take a very careful look at the damning numbers. I watched his arrogant smirk slowly falter as he squinted at the glowing spreadsheet. I explained that 3 months ago, Marcus had begged me to audit your firm because he wanted to invest a significant portion of his personal trust fund with you. I told him I ran a deep forensic analysis on his elite investment portfolios. I traced the incoming capital, the alleged returns, and the offshore holding accounts. I looked directly into the widening eyes of Bradley and watched sheer terror wash over his face. You do not manage billions in assets, Bradley, I stated with absolute clarity. You run a massive textbook Ponzi scheme. The documents on the screen clearly showed he had been using new investor capital to pay fake dividends to older clients for years. I mapped out every single fraudulent transaction, every fabricated quarterly report, and every desperate attempt he made to cover his massive losses. Sarah looked confused, her gaze darting frantically between my calm face and the pale, sweating face of her husband. She demanded to know what I was talking about. She insisted that Bradley was a financial genius who doubled their family wealth. I shifted my gaze to Sarah, almost feeling a fleeting ounce of pity for her profound ignorance. He lost everything, Sarah, I informed her bluntly. Every single dime of your personal money is completely gone. He squandered it trying to keep this pyramid scheme afloat. Bradley tried to stammer a denial, but his voice cracked weakly. I leaned forward and delivered the final devastating piece of information. I told them I submitted my comprehensive audit directly to the Securities and Exchange Commission last week. I informed Bradley that he was completely broke, his firm was a sham, and federal agents were actively securing warrants to raid his corporate offices and seize all his remaining assets by the end of the day. Sarah let out a blood-curdling scream, turning violently on her husband and pounding her fists against his chest. As Bradley tried to restrain his hysterical, newly bankrupt wife, I calmly stepped back and firmly shut the heavy steel door right in their faces. Sunday morning arrived with heavy rain, matching the toxic storm brewing across town. The sanctuary of First Trinity Fellowship was a beacon of old money and generational prestige within the affluent African American community. Crystal chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings, casting a warm glow over rows of mahogany pews. For decades, the Sterling family had occupied the very front row, treating the sacred space more like a personal country club than a place of worship. Today, Joyce intended to use the pulpit as her personal courtroom. The massive sanctuary was packed entirely to maximum capacity. Word of the Sterling family financial crisis had quietly circulated through whispered phone calls and exclusive group chats. Joyce stepped up to the microphone wearing a somber black designer dress and holding a laced handkerchief. She looked out at the congregation, her eyes brimming with perfectly manufactured crocodile tears. She gripped the edges of the wooden pulpit, taking a shaky breath to ensure maximum dramatic effect. She began her performance by lamenting the tragic destruction of her family. She told the silent crowd that her beloved son Marcus was currently suffering through the darkest period of his life. She claimed that the woman they had welcomed into their home with open arms had ruthlessly betrayed them. Joyce pointed a trembling finger toward the empty space in their family pew. She declared that I was a deceitful, money-hungry opportunist who had manipulated my way into their wealthy circle. She loudly insisted that I had faked a medical emergency to steal millions of dollars from their charitable trust fund. She painted a horrifying picture of an unfit mother who had kidnapped two innocent newborn babies and vanished into the night out of pure, unadulterated greed. The congregation gasped in collective horror. Several elderly women in the front rows shook their heads in dismay, clutching their pearls and whispering prayers for the Sterling family. Joyce leaned closer to the microphone, her voice breaking with expertly feigned sorrow. She recounted action-based lies about my working-class background, twisting my history to fit her narrative. She told them I had always been fiercely jealous of their generational wealth because my own parents were struggling blue-collar workers. She claimed she had tried to teach me elegance and grace, but my inherent lower-class nature had ultimately poisoned my judgment. She begged the church community to pray for the safe return of her grandchildren. She pleaded for financial donations to help cover the exorbitant legal fees required to hunt down a dangerous fugitive. Marcus sat in the front row, holding his face in his hands, playing the part of the devastated, heartbroken father. He did not mention Chloe. He did not mention his empty bank accounts or his impending federal subpoena. They were using the sacred trust of their community to completely destroy my reputation and rebuild their shattered public image. The head pastor stepped forward, placing a comforting hand on the shoulder of Joyce, ready to lead the congregation in a special prayer for my immediate arrest. Before the pastor could utter a single word, the massive oak doors at the back of the sanctuary swung open with a resounding crash. The heavy thud echoed loudly against the stained glass windows, instantly silencing the murmurs of the crowd. Every single head in the building turned toward the back entrance. I stood framed in the doorway, the bright morning light silhouetting my figure. I was not hiding. I was not cowering. I was dressed in a tailored, blood-red power suit that commanded absolute attention. My hair was styled in a sleek, immaculate bob, and my posture was rigid with unshakable confidence. I walked slowly down the center aisle. My designer heels clicked rhythmically against the polished marble floor, echoing through the dead silent church. I was not alone. I pushed a pristine top-of-the-line luxury double stroller in front of me. Inside, my two healthy, perfectly dressed babies slept soundly, completely undisturbed by the sudden shift in the atmosphere. The private security team I had quietly hired remained stationed at the back doors, ensuring no one could leave or interfere. Whispers rapidly swept through the pews as people recognized the supposedly dangerous fugitive walking casually through their church. I kept my eyes locked entirely on the pulpit. I watched the fake sorrow on the face of Joyce instantly morph into sheer, unadulterated panic. Marcus stood up quickly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor, but he froze in place, too cowardly to actually approach me. I did not stop walking until I reached the very front of the sanctuary. I parked the luxury stroller safely at the very base of the altar, ensuring the eager congregation could easily see that my children were perfectly safe, healthy, and thriving under my care. I climbed the 3 carpeted steps to the altar without breaking eye contact with my mother-in-law. Joyce took a cautious step backward, her knuckles turning white as she gripped the wooden podium. The head pastor looked completely bewildered, unsure whether to call for the ushers or let the scene unfold. I stepped directly up to the microphone, forcing Joyce to move aside. I reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, heavy black ledger. This was not a prop. It was the master financial record I had meticulously compiled during my forensic audit of their family accounts. I raised the heavy book high in the air for the entire church to see, letting the weight of the moment settle over the silent crowd. Then, with a forceful motion, I slammed the heavy black ledger down onto the wooden pulpit. The loud smack reverberated through the sound system, making several people jump in their seats. I leaned into the microphone, my voice echoing with crystal clear, unwavering authority. "Let us talk about legacy, Joyce," I stated coldly, staring directly into her terrified eyes. "Or should we talk about the church building fund?" The entire sanctuary erupted into a cacophony of shocked gasps and outraged whispers. The phrase building fund was a sacred, highly sensitive topic within First Trinity Fellowship. For over 5 years, the congregation had relentlessly organized bake sales, charity car washes, and pledged significant portions of their modest working-class incomes to renovate the crumbling community center. Hearing me weaponize that specific fund against the wealthiest, most prominent family in the building sent a shockwave of electric tension through the pews. Joyce physically recoiled, her carefully constructed mask of pious suffering completely shattering into fragments of raw, undisguised terror. She looked wildly toward her son, silently pleading for him to fix the unmitigated disaster unfolding in front of their elite peers. Marcus finally found his courage, though it was entirely fueled by desperate self-preservation. He abandoned his front row seat and charged up the carpeted altar steps, his face twisted into a mask of righteous indignation. He threw his hands up in a placating gesture, loudly declaring to the congregation that the traumatic birth had clearly triggered a severe psychological breakdown in my mind. He played the deeply concerned husband, perfectly begging the ushers to help him safely escort his deeply troubled wife away from the microphone before she embarrassed herself further. But the moment he was close enough, the facade dropped entirely. He lunged aggressively toward the heavy black ledger, his fingers clawing frantically at the leather binding. He hissed under his breath, threatening to destroy me if I did not hand over the evidence immediately. I fully anticipated his cowardly ambush. I pivoted smoothly on my designer heels, dodging his clumsy, frantic grab with effortless grace. Marcus stumbled forward, his momentum carrying him awkwardly into the heavy wooden pulpit, knocking the microphone stand askew, with a loud screeching feedback noise that made the congregation wince. Without missing a single beat, I reached into the breast pocket of my tailored red suit and pulled out a small, sleek digital remote. I had not come to a gunfight armed only with a book. I had spent the last 48 hours coordinating with the audiovisual technician of the church, a young college student who had been deeply grateful for the generous anonymous scholarship donation I had arranged. With a single decisive click of the remote, the massive overhead projector screens behind the choir loft flared to life. A crisp, undeniably clear audio recording flooded the cavernous sanctuary, echoing off the stained glass windows and silencing the chaotic room instantly. The voice belonging to Joyce resonated through the state-of-the-art surround sound system stripped of all its usual holy inflection. On the recording, she was speaking to her private accountant, complaining bitterly about the rising costs of maintaining her pristine family image. The congregation sat frozen in absolute horror as the voice of their esteemed elder carelessly detailed exactly how she had systematically siphoned $500,000 directly from the Sacred Community Building Fund over the past 4 years. She laughed coldly on the recording, bragging about how incredibly easy it was to manipulate the quarterly donation ledgers because the church finance committee trusted the Sterling name implicitly. The audio file did not stop at mere theft. Joyce continued her recorded rant, casually explaining exactly where the stolen $500,000 had gone. It had not been invested in real estate or charitable endeavors. The congregation listened in completely paralyzed silence as Joyce listed the names of 3 different women. She complained about the exorbitant hush money required to pay off the previous mistresses of Marcus, including the quiet settlement of a rather explosive paternity claim from 2 years prior. She explicitly stated on the recording that liquidating the church funds was an absolutely necessary sacrifice to protect the flawless reputation of her son. She insisted that preserving his image as a good, devout Christian man for his country club peers was vastly more important than a new roof for the community youth center. The collective outrage of the sanctuary reached a boiling point the very second the audio recording clicked off. This was no longer a private family dispute about a hostile divorce or a bitter custody battle. This was a direct, devastating betrayal of an entire community. The elderly women in the front rows who had previously been praying for the Sterling family were now standing on their feet, pointing trembling fingers of fury at Joyce. Deacons and choir members shouted in pure anger, demanding immediate justice for the money they had sacrificed so much to save. The immaculate, untouchable social standing the Sterling family had ruthlessly maintained for 3 generations completely vaporized in the span of a 3-minute audio clip. The kingdom they had built on lies was actively burning to the ground right in front of them. The head pastor, a man who had dined at the Sterling mansion countless times, stepped forward with a face like thunder. He bypassed Marcus, completely marching directly to the side of the altar and pulling a cell phone from his robes to furiously dial the local authorities. Realizing that her total social destruction was now absolute and criminal charges were imminent, Joyce opted for her final, most desperate theatrical performance. She clutched her chest, let out a dramatic, breathless gasp, and intentionally collapsed onto the marble floor in a perfectly executed theatrical fainting spell. She fully expected her beloved son to rush to her aid and shield her from the angry mob. Instead, Marcus stared at the furious congregation, looked down at his unconscious mother, and completely panicked. Sweating profusely and trembling with absolute cowardice, he pointed a shaking finger directly at the prone body of his mother and screamed at the top of his lungs that it was all her idea. The cowardly accusation echoed off the vaulted ceiling as paramedics rushed past the paralyzed congregation to tend to the motionless matriarch. Marcus did not kneel beside his mother to check her pulse or offer a word of comfort. He backed away from the altar, his hands raised in surrender, actively sacrificing the woman who had protected him his entire life to save his own skin. He pushed through the sea of outraged deacons and disgusted elders, fleeing the holy building like a frightened rat. He knew his reputation was shattered, but his suffocating arrogance convinced him he could still salvage his corporate empire. His entire identity was tied to his lavish office, his tailored suits, and his prestigious investment firm. If he could secure emergency capital by Monday morning, he believed he could easily sweep the embezzlement scandal under the rug. He spent the long weekend ignoring desperate calls from his incarcerated mother, focusing solely on securing his ultimate backup plan. He desperately needed massive cash, and he knew exactly which naive heiress to manipulate. The very next day, Monday morning, arrived with a torrential downpour, but Marcus strutted into the opulent glass lobby of Sterling Financial Partners, acting like he owned the world. He wore his sharpest charcoal suit, projecting an aura of dominance and untouchable wealth. Striding confidently by his side was Chloe, draped in flashy designer labels that screamed new money. She clutched a crocodile skin handbag, looking smugly at the frantic employees rushing around the cubicles. Marcus had spent the previous 2 days convincing her that his temporary cash flow problem was merely a minor clerical error caused by a vindictive former wife. He promised Chloe an equal partnership in the firm and a corner office with a panoramic city view in exchange for a massive cash injection from her personal accounts. He led her directly into the executive boardroom, ignoring the unsettled, panicked atmosphere radiating from the staff. He proudly pushed open the heavy double doors, ready to force his emergency bailout plan down the throats of his very skeptical board. The atmosphere inside the boardroom was suffocating. The 12 senior partners sat rigidly in their plush leather chairs, their faces pale and their expressions grim. No one offered Marcus a greeting. No one looked at Chloe. The board chairman, a seasoned financial veteran named Arthur, sat at the far end of the long mahogany table, massaging his temples as if fighting off a migraine. Marcus ignored the obvious tension, pulling out a chair for his mistress before taking his usual spot near the front. He slammed a glossy financial portfolio onto the polished wood, loudly declaring that he had successfully solved their temporary liquidity crisis. He arrogantly gestured toward Chloe, introducing her to the silent room as the savior of Sterling Financial Partners. He proudly announced that her vast personal capital would immediately erase the corporate debt I had uncovered, stabilizing their shares and securing their elite market position. He waited for validation. Arthur lowered his hands, staring at Marcus with profound pity mixed with disgust. He did not look at the glossy portfolio. He did not acknowledge the eager mistress sitting at the table. Arthur took a deep, shaky breath and informed Marcus that his generous bailout offer was irrelevant and too late. The chairman bluntly announced that the firm no longer possessed the legal authority to accept outside capital or restructure its own internal debt. Marcus frowned, his arrogant smirk slipping as he demanded an explanation. Arthur stated that the company had been subjected to a hostile, aggressive buyout over the weekend. A silent majority shareholder had acquired every ounce of their toxic debt, legally seizing total control of their voting shares and liquidating their executive power. Marcus turned a sickly shade of gray, demanding to know the identity of the raider who stole his company. The frosted glass doors of the boardroom swung open before Arthur could utter a syllable. I stepped over the threshold wearing a razor-sharp black tailored suit and holding a manila folder. The board of directors immediately stood up from their chairs in a show of respect. Marcus remained glued to his seat, his eyes bulging as if he were staring at a terrifying ghost. I walked with precision toward the head of the mahogany table. Arthur respectfully stepped aside, allowing me to take the executive chair that Marcus had spent a decade treating as his personal throne. I sat down smoothly, placing my folder on the table and folding my hands together. I looked directly into the panicked, sweating face of my soon-to-be former husband. The terror radiating from him was satisfying. I smiled coldly, leaning slightly forward. "You are officially fired, Marcus," I stated, my voice echoing with finality. "You will leave this building immediately, or my security team will drag you out in handcuffs." The room fell into a stunned silence. Marcus looked physically ill, his breathing shallow and rapid. Suddenly, a sharp laugh shattered the tension. Chloe leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms and rolling her eyes with arrogance. She flipped her blonde hair over her shoulder, misreading the severity of the situation. She loudly declared that my power trip meant nothing in the real world. She pointed a manicured finger at me, boasting that her father was a billionaire real estate tycoon with endless resources. She promised the silent boardroom that her daddy would simply buy the investment firm back by the end of the day, fire me permanently, and reinstate Marcus as the undisputed chief executive officer. She smirked at me, vibrating with entitlement, confident that her generational wealth made her completely untouchable. I did not flinch, raise my voice, or show an ounce of intimidation. I slowly and deliberately opened my manila folder, retrieved my personal cell phone, and placed it gently on the polished mahogany wood. I smiled directly at her, radiating absolute lethal calm. "Let us call him right now then and see." The heavy glass boardroom doors flew open before Chloe could even reach into her purse to retrieve her phone. A towering man with silver hair and a crimson face stormed into the room, his expensive Italian suit jacket flapping behind him like a cape. This was Harrison Vance, the infamous billionaire real estate tycoon, and the man Chloe had just smugly invoked to save her doomed lover. He had clearly been waiting in the executive lobby, anticipating a victorious entrance to finalize the hostile takeover of Sterling Financial Partners. He marched directly toward the head of the table, his eyes locked entirely on me with absolute murderous intent. Harrison slammed both of his massive hands down onto the polished mahogany wood, leaning over me in a textbook display of corporate intimidation. He loudly demanded to know who I was and what gave me the audacity to steal a company right out from under his nose. He threatened to bury me under an avalanche of aggressive litigation, boasting that his legal team would tie me up in federal court until I was completely bankrupt and begging for mercy. He promised to personally ensure that I would never work in the financial sector again. Chloe instantly sprang up from her leather chair, rushing over to link her arm through the elbow of her father. She pointed her manicured finger at my face, excitedly telling her father that I was the vindictive, deranged former wife Marcus had warned them about. She whined that I was currently trying to ruin their perfect future out of pure, unadulterated jealousy. Marcus stood frozen near the back wall, his eyes darting frantically between Harrison and the silent, observing board members. He looked like a cornered animal, silently praying that the billionaire patriarch would make good on his aggressive threats and somehow magically restore his shattered corporate kingdom. Harrison puffed out his chest, glaring down at me with supreme arrogance, waiting for me to cower, apologize, or flee the room in absolute terror. I did not move a single muscle. I sat comfortably in the plush executive chair, maintaining my perfect posture and keeping my hands neatly folded over my manila folder. I allowed his arrogant threats to hang in the dead, silent air of the boardroom for a long, uncomfortable moment. When the silence stretched on long enough to make Harrison slightly shift his weight in confusion, I finally spoke. My voice was completely devoid of emotion, maintaining a quiet, razor-sharp clarity that instantly commanded the attention of every single person in the room. I politely informed Harrison Vance that he had made a catastrophic miscalculation by confusing me with a helpless, naive housewife. I reminded him that I was a highly trained certified forensic accountant who had spent the last 7 years successfully dismantling complex financial fraud networks for corporate clients across the globe. I reached into my leather briefcase and retrieved a sleek silver iPad. I tapped the glowing screen twice, bringing up a highly detailed, incredibly complex financial flowchart. Without breaking eye contact with the furious billionaire, I slid the smooth device straight down the center of the mahogany table. It glided perfectly, coming to a dead stop, exactly inches from his fingertips. I gestured casually toward the glowing screen, inviting him to take a very close look at his own financial demise. Harrison scoffed loudly, rolling his eyes, as he snatched up the tablet. He fully intended to mock whatever pathetic evidence I thought I had gathered against him. However, the very second, his eyes scanned the top line of the glowing digital document, his entire arrogant demeanor completely vaporized. I watched with immense satisfaction as the deep crimson anger completely drained from his face, leaving behind an ashen, sickly pale complexion. The flowchart displayed on the screen was a meticulously detailed map of his most heavily guarded secrets. I calmly narrated the contents for the benefit of the completely silent board of directors. I explained that tracing the emergency capital Chloe had attempted to inject into the firm had been incredibly easy. Following that money trail led me directly into a massive, highly illegal labyrinth of offshore tax evasion networks. I listed the names of his dummy corporations in the Cayman Islands, his anonymous shell companies in Panama, and the illegal wire transfers he had systematically used to hide millions of dollars from the federal government over the past decade. Harrison visibly trembled, his knuckles turning pure white as he gripped the edges of the tablet. Chloe looked back and forth between her terrified father and my calm face, completely failing to grasp the gravity of the situation. She tugged on his sleeve, whining at him to stop looking at the stupid screen and just fire me already. I ignored her entirely, leaning forward to deliver the final crushing blow. I informed Harrison that the flowchart was merely the cover page of a massive, undeniably comprehensive digital dossier. I stated clearly that every single bank record, wire transfer receipt, and illegal corporate filing had already been compiled, verified, and packaged into a secure, encrypted file. I smiled coldly, letting him know that the entire dossier was currently queued in my outbox, ready to be sent directly to the highest level directors at the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service with a single keystroke. The billionaire real estate tycoon understood exactly what that meant. Pure panic instantly overrode his paternal instincts and corporate pride. He dropped the silver iPad as if physically burned. Harrison pointed a shaking finger directly at my former husband. He loudly declared he had absolutely no business relationship with Sterling Financial Partners. Chloe gasped, grabbing his expensive suit jacket. She screamed, demanding to know his intentions. Harrison violently grabbed his daughter, completely unrelenting. He dragged his kicking, screaming daughter backward through the glass doors. The heavy doors swung shut abruptly, silencing her frantic cries. Marcus stood alone at the back of the boardroom, ruined and unemployed. The heavy frosted glass doors slowly swung shut, clicking into place and sealing Marcus inside his own personal tomb. He stared at the empty space where his billionaire salvation had just violently dragged his mistress away, his chest heaving with shallow, erratic breaths. The 12 senior board members did not linger to offer condolences or say goodbye. They practically trampled each other to exit the room, eager to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout of the Sterling family name. Within seconds, the expansive executive boardroom was entirely empty, save for the two of us. I remained seated at the head of the polished mahogany table, calmly stacking my legal documents and sliding my digital remote back into my leather briefcase. The silence between us was heavy, thick with the undeniable reality that his meticulously crafted empire had just evaporated into thin air. Marcus turned slowly, his eyes bloodshot, and his tailored charcoal suit suddenly looking wrinkled and too large for his deflating frame. The aristocratic arrogance that had defined him for a decade was entirely gone, replaced by the feral, unpredictable energy of a cornered animal. He began to pace the width of the room, his expensive leather shoes scraping aggressively against the imported rug. He muttered frantically to himself, running his trembling fingers through his perfectly styled hair until it stood on end. When his erratic pacing brought him to the far side of the table, he abruptly stopped. He slammed his palms onto the wood, leaning forward with a desperate, manic gleam in his eyes. If he could not win through corporate manipulation or wealthy alliances, he was fully prepared to drag me down into the mud with him. He reached into his pocket and yanked out his personal smartphone, his thumb swiping aggressively across the screen. He marched directly toward my chair, shoving the bright digital display inches from my face. He demanded that I look closely at the screen, his voice dropping to a harsh, venomous whisper. He presented a gallery of highly compromising, incredibly explicit photographs featuring my face seamlessly grafted onto the bodies of other women in deeply scandalous scenarios. He explained with a sick, triumphant sneer that he had hired a black market tech firm to generate these AI-driven deepfake images weeks ago, holding them as an insurance policy just in case I refused to surrender during our divorce proceedings. The images were frighteningly realistic, explicitly designed to completely obliterate the reputation of any high-powered female executive in the conservative financial sector. Marcus laid out his desperate extortion terms with breathless urgency. He demanded an immediate, untraceable wire transfer of $12 million to a specific offshore account in the Bahamas. He threatened that if the funds did not clear his account within the next 10 minutes, he would hit a single button and automatically blast the deep fake gallery to every major financial news outlet, every board member of Sterling Financial Partners, and every high net worth client in my professional network. He stood over me, vibrating with manic adrenaline, completely convinced that he had finally backed me into an inescapable corner. He barked a sharp laugh, demanding to know how my pristine forensic accounting career would survive a viral, humiliating scandal that would live on the internet forever. I looked at the glowing screen, carefully noting the subtle pixelation around the necklines and the artificial lighting casting unnatural shadows. I did not gasp, beg, or reach for the device. Instead, I leaned back in my plush executive chair, folded my arms across my chest, and let out a sharp, genuinely amused laugh. The cold sound echoed loudly against the glass walls of the boardroom, completely shattering the illusion of his dominance. Marcus flinched, his triumphant sneer faltering as utter confusion washed over his face. He aggressively shook the phone at me, his voice pitching higher as he demanded to know what was so funny about the total destruction of my entire professional life. He warned me that he was not bluffing and began counting down the seconds until he initiated the mass email protocol. I casually reached into my briefcase and retrieved my own phone, tapping the screen once to awaken it. I informed Marcus that his utter predictability was his greatest weakness. I explained that when I legally seized the majority voting shares of his firm over the weekend, my very first executive action was to authorize a top-tier cybersecurity sweep of the entire corporate network, including all devices registered to the Sterling executive team. I maintained direct eye contact with him as I pressed a single glowing red icon on my screen, triggering an immediate and devastating corporate security lockdown. The reaction was instantaneous. The screen of the phone Marcus was holding violently flickered, flashed a bright warning red, and then went completely irreparably black. A fatal error code briefly appeared before the device rebooted into a factory-wiped state. Marcus frantically mashed the power button, his thumb desperately swiping at the dead glass. I calmly explained that my private cybersecurity team had just initiated a remote detonation of his entire digital footprint. Every single local file cloud drive and hidden server associated with his accounts had been simultaneously encrypted, permanently locked, and wiped clean. His ultimate leverage was gone, evaporated into the digital ether in less than 2 seconds. Marcus dropped the useless blank piece of metal and glass onto the table, his breath hitching in his chest. His feral rage dissolved into pure pathetic panic. He gripped the edge of the mahogany table, his knuckles white, and begged me to just give him the $12 million. He pleaded that it was merely a fraction of the firm's total liquid assets, a drop in the bucket that he desperately needed to escape the impending federal indictments and flee the country. He promised he would vanish forever, leaving me in total control of the empire if I just signed over the funds immediately. I stood up slowly, picking up my briefcase and ensuring my suit jacket was perfectly smooth. I leaned across the massive mahogany table, closing the distance between us until I was looking directly into his terrified, broken eyes. I let the absolute silence of the room stretch for a moment, ensuring he would hear and comprehend every single syllable of my final statement. I never kept the $12 million, Marcus. I legally routed every single cent to the working-class vendors and contractors you and your mother defrauded over the last 10 years. The money is gone, and so are you. The hollow echo of my final words paralyzed Marcus entirely, leaving him gasping for air in the silent boardroom while his stolen empire crumbled around his designer shoes. Miles away from that corporate slaughterhouse, his mother was experiencing her own spectacular fall from grace. Joyce stepped out of the freezing municipal detention center after enduring a grueling 24 hours in a concrete holding cell. Her expensive silk blouse was severely wrinkled, and her immaculate blowout had collapsed into a tangled mess of brittle blonde hair. She had been forced to liquidate her last remaining private retirement account just to post the exorbitant bail set by a highly unsympathetic judge. The crushing humiliation of being fingerprinted and photographed like a common street criminal burned through her veins like battery acid. She knew her elite social circle was already gossiping about her spectacular arrest. She needed a target to unleash her toxic fury upon, and she knew exactly where to find one. Since I was heavily guarded by private security and legally untouchable, she set her sights on the working-class people she blamed for producing me. Joyce drove her least luxury sedan aggressively across the city limits, crossing the invisible boundary that separated the sprawling gated estates from the modest blue-collar neighborhoods. She pulled up sharply onto the cracked concrete driveway of my parents. The small single-story house sat on a narrow plot of land, featuring a meticulously kept vegetable garden and a faded wooden porch. For decades, Joyce had openly mocked my background, treating my parents like absolute garbage whenever forced to interact with them at holiday events. She viewed their honest labor and quiet dignity as a personal insult to her generational wealth. She slammed her car door shut, marching up the concrete walkway with pure venom radiating from her eyes. She did not bother to knock. She bypassed the doorbell, completely turning the brass knob and violently shoving her way straight into the quiet sanctuary of my childhood home. My parents, Arthur and Helen, were sitting comfortably at their small circular dining table reading the morning newspaper. They did not jump up in shock or scramble to accommodate the sudden home invasion. Joyce stood in the center of their modest living room, breathing heavily like a rabid animal. She sneered at the worn fabric of their sofa and the framed family photographs lining the narrow hallway. She unleashed a torrential downpour of unhinged screaming, completely abandoning her fake pious persona. She loudly declared that their monstrous, vindictive daughter had orchestrated an illegal coup to destroy her innocent family. She pointed a manicured, trembling finger directly at my father, threatening to use her remaining political connections on the city zoning board to absolutely ruin them. She promised to declare their small house a public nuisance, have the property condemned, and throw them out onto the street with nothing but the clothes on their backs. She shrieked that working-class nobodies could never defeat old money, and she would ensure they spent their retirement living in absolute poverty. Helen calmly reached out and poured a stream of hot chamomile tea from a ceramic pot into two matching floral cups. She slid one cup toward her husband and took a slow, measured sip from her own. Arthur carefully folded the sports section of the newspaper, setting it neatly aside. He looked up at the screaming, wealthy matriarch with an expression of mild, polite curiosity. He gestured toward a vacant wooden chair, offering her a seat and a warm beverage. This display of total unbothered serenity pushed Joyce past the brink of sanity. She violently slapped the offered teacup off the table, sending hot liquid and shattered ceramic flying across the linoleum floor. She screamed that she did not want their pathetic charity. She boasted wildly that she still had incredibly powerful allies at the Oak Ridge Estates Country Club. She claimed her elite billionaire friends would happily fund a massive legal campaign to crush my parents into dust just to make an example out of them. She stood tall, trying to command the small room with the ghost of her former prestige. Arthur did not flinch when the cup shattered. He simply sighed, shaking his head at the childish temper tantrum. He reached down to a heavy fireproof lockbox sitting quietly beneath the telephone table. He entered a quick digital code and pulled out a thick, heavy stack of notarized legal documents. He tossed the heavy manila folder directly onto the table where the teacup had just been. He leaned back in his chair, lacing his fingers together over his chest. He calmly informed Joyce that she was severely underestimating the financial reach of a highly motivated forensic accountant. He slid a crisp white deed of trust across the table, explaining that I had not just recovered the stolen funds from her fraudulent building accounts. I had strategically secured the future of my family. He tapped the heavy paper, confirming that he and Helen now legally owned every single house on this block in full outright cash. The city zoning board could not touch them because they were now the largest private landowners in the district. Joyce stared at the property deed, her jaw slightly slackening as the reality of their sudden financial elevation began to process in her panicked brain. But Arthur was not finished. He reached into the folder and produced one final heavily embossed corporate document. He slid it directly toward her shaking hands. He explained in a quiet, deeply authoritative voice that commercial real estate holding companies were fascinating structures. He detailed how a massive corporate entity had recently acquired the highly coveted acres of pristine rolling hills on the north side of the city. He watched the blood completely drain from the face of Joyce as he explicitly named the holding company. It was the exact corporate entity that owned the land and the primary lease for the Oak Ridge Estates Country Club. Arthur smiled warmly, taking another sip of his tea. He politely informed her that he and Helen were the majority shareholders of that specific holding company, making them the supreme landlords of her final high society sanctuary. As Joyce frantically shook her head, refusing to accept this catastrophic reality, her cell phone vibrated violently inside her purse. She pulled the device out with trembling fingers, opening an urgent email from the country club board of directors. The message was explicitly clear, stating that her generational membership was permanently revoked and she was banned from the premises effective immediately. The phone slipped from her manicured fingers, clattering loudly against the linoleum floor, as the reality of her total social excommunication finally registered. For a fleeting second, Joyce looked like a fragile, broken woman, entirely stripped of the artificial armor her wealth had always provided. That vulnerability lasted exactly one heartbeat before it was completely consumed by a toxic, blinding rage. She lunged forward, her face twisting into a grotesque mask of pure hatred, promising my parents that she would see us all begging on the streets. She stormed out of the modest house, the heavy wooden door slamming shut so violently that the framed photographs in the hallway rattled against the floral wallpaper. Joyce had absolutely no intention of accepting defeat. She immediately weaponized the last remaining dregs of her liquid capital, hiring a notoriously ruthless litigator named Alistair Vance. Vance was a legal mercenary, a man infamous for destroying opponents through aggressive intimidation tactics and exploiting obscure technicalities in property law. Within 48 hours, he filed a malicious emergency injunction, claiming to have discovered a critical hidden loophole in the original deed of the Sterling estate. He demanded an immediate mandatory hearing in civil court, legally dragging me away from my forensic investigations to defend the assets I had rightfully seized. The fluorescent lighting of the municipal courtroom was harsh and unforgiving, offering a stark contrast to the luxurious environments the Sterling family usually inhabited. Joyce sat rigidly at the plaintiff's table, her posture radiating supreme arrogance, flanked by the imposing custom-suited figure of Alistair Vance. When the judge signaled for the proceedings to begin, Vance did not present a structured legal argument. He launched a deeply personal, vicious character assassination, entirely designed to paint me as an unstable, deeply vindictive, and emotionally disturbed woman. He dramatically paced the floor, spinning a wild narrative about a scorned, unhinged wife who was illegally abusing her corporate accounting credentials to execute a malicious vendetta against her innocent, unsuspecting former in-laws. He practically shouted that my seizure of the sprawling Sterling mansion was not a lawful corporate restructuring, but an act of pure, unadulterated theft. Vance confidently presented a stack of highly manipulated, selectively redacted property documents, arguing that a historical zoning technicality completely invalidated my claim to the estate. He demanded that the judge immediately restore the mansion to Joyce, asserting that I was a dangerous predator actively trying to dismantle a legacy I could never comprehend. I sat alone at the defense table, completely unbothered by the theatrical venom echoing through the sterile room. I did not interrupt object or show a single ounce of emotional distress. I waited patiently until Vance finally exhausted his vocabulary of insults and confidently returned to his seat. The judge, a no-nonsense woman with tired eyes, looked down at me, asking if I had any response to these incredibly severe allegations. I stood up smoothly, buttoning my tailored blazer, and connected a sleek digital tablet to the courtroom overhead projector. I politely informed the judge that while Mr. Vance had delivered a spectacular piece of dramatic fiction, I preferred to rely strictly on immutable verified mathematics. The large monitor flickered to life, displaying a dense, incredibly complex web of financial transactions, wire transfers, and corporate shell entities. I began my presentation, my voice maintaining a calm, razor-sharp clarity that instantly commanded the absolute attention of every single person in the room. I projected a high-resolution, unredacted copy of the original mansion deed alongside 3 separate verified offshore bank statements. I methodically guided the judge through the chaotic maze of Joyce's personal finances, dissecting her fraudulent empire in real time. I revealed that the technicality Vance was desperately clinging to was completely irrelevant, because the Sterling family had never actually owned the estate outright. I displayed a relentless chronological forensic paper trail showing exactly how Joyce had systematically leveraged the mansion for massive high-interest loans over the last decade. She had secretly drained the equity of the property to fund her extravagant international vacations, her designer wardrobe, and the exorbitant legal fees required to cover up her numerous corporate indiscretions. The glowing screen documented every single illegal maneuver, tracking the rapid depletion of her liquid assets month by month. Vance jumped out of his chair, loudly objecting and frantically trying to dismiss my digital evidence as circumstantial conjecture. The judge silenced him immediately with a sharp, authoritative warning, instructing me to continue my financial breakdown. Joyce was visibly trembling now, her arrogant posture collapsing as she watched her most fiercely guarded secrets broadcast on a massive screen in a public courtroom. I tapped the glowing tablet one final time, bringing up the most critical document of the entire hearing. It was a comprehensive ledger detailing the exact origin of the funds used to falsely maintain the mansion's mortgage over the previous 60 months. I turned directly toward my former mother-in-law, my voice dropping to a low, crushing register. I informed the court that the Sterling family wealth had actually dried up years ago. The sprawling estate, the luxury vehicles, and the country club memberships had not been funded by a successful corporate empire. I presented undeniable, irrefutable proof that Joyce had illegally tapped into my personal business accounts, using a sophisticated web of dummy corporations to funnel millions of dollars of my own hard-earned corporate consulting revenue directly into her private mortgage payments. I proved beyond any shadow of a doubt that every single brick of her prestigious mansion had actually been purchased using my stolen earnings. The entire courtroom fell completely, stunningly silent. The judge stared at the undeniable financial evidence, her expression hardening into absolute fury. She picked up her heavy wooden gavel and slammed it down with a deafening crack, immediately ordering a total, uncompromising freeze on every single asset associated with Joyce Sterling. The matriarch was finally left with absolutely nothing, her fraudulent empire entirely destroyed by the very woman she had spent a decade trying to systematically ruin and erase. The resounding crack of the judge's gavel was still echoing in my ears when Marcus launched his most desperate and despicable counterattack. Stripped of his corporate power and watching his mother's wealth evaporate into a frozen legal abyss, my former husband realized he had only one remaining pressure point left to exploit. Less than 24 hours after Joyce's catastrophic courtroom defeat, I was served with emergency legal papers at my new residence. Marcus was filing for immediate full physical and legal custody of our infant twins. He weaponized my recent victories against me, submitting a sprawling, entirely fabricated affidavit, claiming that my aggressive financial investigations proved I was a vindictive absentee mother, completely consumed by corporate warfare. He painted a gruesome, entirely fictional picture of a neglected home where the babies were left unattended while I ruthlessly dismantled the Sterling family legacy. His filings argued that my forensic accounting work was a dangerous obsession, rendering me psychologically unfit to provide a stable environment for our children. The family court hearing was scheduled with terrifying emergency speed, dropping us into a claustrophobic, sterile room that smelled of floor wax and stale coffee. Marcus sat at the petitioner's table looking perfectly groomed, wearing a conservative navy suit explicitly designed to project the image of a stable, concerned patriarch. His attorney, a shark-like family law specialist known for brutal smear campaigns, immediately called their star witness to the stand. A young mousy woman with nervously darting eyes took the oath. She introduced herself as Clara, claiming to be a private high-end childcare professional. Clara confidently testified that I had hired her months ago to watch the twins, stating that I routinely abandoned them for days at a time to pursue my financial vendettas. She spun tragic, excruciatingly detailed lies about finding the babies crying in soiled clothes while I was allegedly locked in my home office, maniacally plotting the destruction of my in-laws. Marcus wiped away a perfectly timed artificial tear, shaking his head in manufactured disgust at my supposed maternal failures. My own attorney leaned toward me, his brow furrowed in concentration as he prepared to dismantle her testimony through standard legal objections and cross-examination tactics. I placed a firm hand on his forearm, silently instructing him to stand down. I did not need standard legal maneuvering. I needed to expose a blatant, verifiable, and highly illegal lie. I requested formal permission from the bench to personally cross-examine the witness, citing my status as a pro se co-counsel for the financial elements of this custody dispute. The judge, clearly intrigued by the intensity of the proceedings and aware of the high-profile nature of the Sterling collapse, granted my request. I stood up, smoothing the front of my tailored charcoal blazer, and walked slowly toward the witness stand. I did not carry a legal pad or a stack of printed notes. I carried only my encrypted silver tablet, the exact same device that had repeatedly brought the Sterling family empire to its knees. Clara shifted uncomfortably in her wooden chair, her previously rehearsed confidence visibly faltering as I locked eyes with her. I began with a deceptively gentle tone, asking Clara to clarify the exact dates of her alleged employment in my home. She rattled off a specific 3-month window, citing days she claimed I had left the house before dawn and returned long after midnight. I nodded thoughtfully, allowing her to dig the hole deeper into the official court record. I then asked her to confirm her hourly rate and the specific method of payment she received for this intensive round-the-clock childcare. Clara, glancing nervously at Marcus for reassurance, stated she was paid entirely in cash on a weekly basis to keep things off the books at my explicit request. I let out a sharp, cold laugh that caused the court reporter to jump and the judge to raise an eyebrow. I informed the witness that as a certified forensic accountant who had spent the last decade tracking international fraud and dismantling money laundering rings, I absolutely never dealt in untraceable cash. I tapped the screen of my tablet, wirelessly transmitting a highly secured document to the digital monitors mounted on the judge's bench and the witness stand. I asked Clara to take a very close look at the highlighted digital ledger, now glowing directly in front of her face. It was a comprehensive, perfectly tracked list of international wire transfers intercepted during my initial deep dive into Marcus's corporate malfeasance. I pointed to a specific series of recurring payments, explicitly matching the exact timeline she had just sworn to under oath. The transfers were not coming from any domestic account bearing my name. They were routed through a heavily guarded, anonymized shell company based in the Cayman Islands. I stated clearly, ensuring the court reporter captured every syllable, that this specific offshore account was exclusively controlled by Marcus Sterling. I asked Clara to explain to the judge why my allegedly neglected children were being cared for by a woman secretly receiving international wire transfers from their father's hidden tax evasion network. Clara's face turned the color of wet ash. She stared at the glowing routing numbers, her breathing accelerating into a full-blown panic attack as the reality of her perjury settled over her. Marcus lunged out of his chair, his face purple with rage, shouting wild objections and demanding the judge dismiss the financial documents as inadmissible, illegally obtained hearsay. The judge violently struck her gavel, ordering Marcus to sit down immediately or face detention for contempt of court. The harsh, echoing crack of the wood shattered whatever remaining resolve Clara possessed. She gripped the edges of the witness stand, her entire body trembling as she looked from the damning financial records to the furious, terrifying face of my former husband. The young woman broke down into violent, hysterical sobs, burying her face in her hands. Between gasping, jagged breaths, Clara cried out that she had never even met my children. She confessed loudly and unequivocally on the public record that Marcus had ordered her to lie and paid her an exorbitant sum to destroy me on the stand. The judge's face turned a dangerous shade of crimson as Clara's sobbing confession echoed off the wood-paneled walls. Judge Morrison did not merely dismiss Marcus's emergency custody petition. She systematically tore him apart from the bench. She ordered an immediate perjury investigation into the fabricated testimony and heavily sanctioned his high-priced attorney for bringing a fraudulent witness into her courtroom. Marcus stood paralyzed at the petitioner's table, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish, while the last remaining fragments of his reputation disintegrated into dust. I did not wait to watch the bailiffs escort him out of the building. I simply packed my tablet, gave the judge a respectful nod, and walked out into the crisp afternoon air, knowing my children were finally safe. That fleeting sense of security lasted exactly 72 hours. I was in the middle of preparing a fresh batch of pureed organic carrots for the twins when 3 sharp, heavy knocks rattled my mahogany front door. It was a Tuesday morning long before any expected deliveries, and my private security team had already verified the identities of the visitors at the outer gate. I wiped my hands on a linen towel and opened the door to find 2 stern-faced agents wearing official state lanyards. They introduced themselves as investigators for Child Protective Services, stating they had received an urgent anonymous tip regarding severe neglect and child endangerment at this address. The sheer predictability of the tactic almost made me smile. Joyce, entirely bankrupt and publicly humiliated, had resorted to the ultimate form of cowardly bureaucratic warfare. She was attempting to use the state to steal the children she had ignored since birth. I stepped aside smoothly, opening the door wide and graciously inviting the investigators inside. I offered them fresh coffee and a comfortable seat in my sunlit living room. The lead agent, a hardened woman who had clearly expected to walk into a scene of squalor and chaos, paused as her eyes scanned the environment. My home was utterly immaculate, smelling faintly of lavender and warm cinnamon. The twins were sitting happily in their state-of-the-art playpen, giggling as they stacked brightly colored wooden blocks. There were no sharp edges, no hazardous materials, and absolutely no signs of the severe neglect the anonymous caller had so frantically described. The male investigator awkwardly checked his clipboard, glancing back and forth between the pristine, joyful environment and the dire, terrifying accusations written on his official intake form. He cleared his throat, awkwardly apologizing for the intrusion while admitting that their department was legally required to follow up on all high-priority emergency tips regardless of how baseless they appeared upon arrival. I poured 2 cups of coffee and placed them neatly on the glass coffee table, assuring the agents that I completely understood their professional obligations. I then sat down across from them, maintaining a posture of calm, unwavering authority. I informed them that while their anonymous caller had intentionally wasted state resources with malicious lies, I actually possessed something that required their immediate, undivided attention. I reached onto the lower shelf of my bookshelf and retrieved a thick, heavily reinforced binder. I slid it across the glass surface, coming to a rest right next to their coffee cups. I explained that as a forensic accountant, I did not deal in petty rumors or anonymous phone calls. I dealt strictly in verified, undeniable facts. I urged them to open the binder, warning them that the contents were deeply disturbing but entirely necessary for the safety of my children. The lead agent slowly flipped open the heavy cover, her professional skepticism instantly vanishing as she scanned the first page. I had compiled a devastating, meticulously documented dossier exposing the darkest, most heavily guarded secrets of Marcus Sterling. The file contained verified admission records from 3 separate, highly exclusive rehabilitation centers that Joyce had paid millions to keep out of the press. I included redacted police reports detailing violent drug-fueled outbursts at luxury hotels, incidents that had been quietly swept under the rug by high-priced fixers. I provided toxicology reports, erratic text message transcripts, and sworn affidavits from former domestic staff detailing his aggressive, unpredictable behavior when under the influence. Every single page dismantled the illusion of the stable, wealthy patriarch, revealing a deeply unstable addict with a severe propensity for violence. The male investigator's face paled as he reviewed a graphic incident report from a trashed penthouse suite in Miami. The investigators did not finish their coffee. They closed the binder with a heavy, definitive thud, their entire demeanor shifting from routine bureaucratic inquiry to acute high-alert emergency protocol. The lead agent looked me directly in the eye, thanking me for my extreme thoroughness and assuring me that my children were in excellent hands. She stated firmly that the true threat to the twins was clearly not residing in this house. The agents practically sprinted out the front door, furiously dialing their supervisors to initiate an immediate targeted investigation into Marcus. Hours later, the profound silence of my home was shattered by the frantic vibrating of my personal cell phone. I answered to the sound of Marcus weeping hysterically, his voice cracking as he begged me to call off the state investigators tearing through his temporary apartment. He pleaded for mercy, swearing he would sign away all parental rights if I just stopped the absolute destruction of his life. I did not offer a single word of comfort. I listened to the desperate, pathetic sound of his pleading until the unmistakable, piercing wail of approaching police sirens drowned out his voice. I held the phone to my ear for just a fraction of a second longer, letting the chaotic symphony of flashing lights and shouting officers wash over the line. It was the sound of a carefully constructed empire finally collapsing under the unbearable weight of its own arrogance. I pressed a single button on the smooth screen, instantly severing the connection and plunging him into total darkness. The sharp click of my phone disconnecting marked the definitive end of Marcus Sterling's reign, but the fallout from his family's collapse was far from over. I walked into the expansive glass lobby of my corporate headquarters the following morning, savoring the quiet hum of a business running with absolute precision. My heels clicked rhythmically against the polished marble floor as I headed toward the private executive elevators. Before I could even reach the security turnstiles, a frantic, disheveled figure lunged from the plush waiting area and physically blocked my path. It was Sarah Marcus's older sister, a woman who had spent the entirety of my marriage treating me like an uninvited servant. Gone were her customary designer silks and arrogant, practiced smirks. She looked completely hollowed out, wearing a wrinkled trench coat over yesterday's clothes, her eyes darting around the lobby with the desperate, hunted energy of a cornered animal. For years, she had paraded her generational wealth and her perfect marriage to a prominent investment banker as proof of her genetic superiority. Now that glittering facade lay in absolute ruins. The financial news networks had spent the entire weekend broadcasting the spectacular implosion of her husband's massive Ponzi scheme. The federal government had seized their sprawling Hamptons estate, frozen their offshore accounts, and indicted him on 70 counts of wire fraud. Sarah grabbed my wrist with trembling fingers, completely ignoring the two security guards who immediately stepped forward to intercept her. I raised a single hand, signaling my team to stand down, curious to see exactly how low the Sterling family's golden daughter had sunk. Her voice cracked as she began to speak, the haughty cadence replaced by a pathetic, desperate whine. She practically begged me for a private conversation, insisting that we were still family and that she had nowhere else to turn. I gestured toward an isolated glass conference room near the reception desk, leading her inside and leaving the door wide open so my staff could witness every second of the interaction. Sarah collapsed into a leather chair, sobbing uncontrollably as she detailed the total devastation of her life. She confessed that her husband's federal assets freeze had left her with literally nothing, not even enough cash to buy groceries or secure a cheap motel room. Her former wealthy friends had entirely abandoned her, blocking her numbers the minute the federal agents raided her charity gala. She looked up at me with mascara streaking her cheeks, pleading for an emergency loan of $200,000. She swore she would pay it back the moment the legal dust settled, leaning entirely on the phantom prestige of her ruined surname. I remained standing, looking down at the weeping woman who had once publicly mocked my simple, modest background at her own wedding rehearsal. I calmly informed Sarah that the sterling name held absolutely no currency in my building, and I was not operating a charity for disgraced socialites. I explicitly reminded her of the countless family dinners where she had sneered at my career, claiming that women only worked when their husbands failed to properly provide for them. I watched her face burn with deep, agonizing humiliation as those arrogant, cruel words were weaponized and thrown directly back at her. I told her that I would not hand over a single cent of my personal capital to fund her temporary comfort. Sarah's expression hardened briefly, a flash of her old entitled fury surfacing as she accused me of enjoying her suffering. I did not deny it. I maintained steady, unbroken eye contact, stating that my financial success was built on ruthless efficiency, not sentimental bailouts for people who actively participated in my abuse. I turned toward the conference room door, signaling that our brief interaction had concluded. She lunged forward again, catching the sleeve of my blazer, sobbing that she was completely out of options and would end up sleeping on the streets by nightfall. I stopped, letting a long, heavy silence stretch between us as I calculated my next move. I slowly turned back around and presented a counteroffer that I knew would shatter whatever remaining pride she possessed. I informed her that while I absolutely refused to hand over cash, my corporate records department was currently experiencing a backlog. I offered her a permanent position as a junior filing clerk starting immediately. The terms were strictly unconditional. She would earn minimum wage, clock in at 7 every morning, wear a standard uniform, and report directly to a supervisor 10 years her junior. The position involved hauling heavy cardboard boxes, scanning thousands of invoices, and organizing the physical archives in the basement level of the building. She would be working at the absolute bottom of the corporate ladder for the exact same woman she used to relentlessly mock. Sarah stared at me in stunned, horrified silence, her mouth opening and closing as her brain tried to process the sheer magnitude of the insult. The golden daughter of the Sterling dynasty was being offered a menial, grueling job. She looked around the pristine corporate lobby, then down at her shaking hands, weighing her shattered ego against her terrifying reality of impending homelessness. The fight entirely drained from her eyes. Humbled, utterly broken, and suffocating under the weight of her desperation, Sarah slowly nodded her head and accepted the humiliating position. She wiped her stained face, reaching deep into the hidden pocket of her wrinkled trench coat. She whispered that she needed to offer a token of goodwill to secure this fragile truce. Her shaking fingers produced a heavy, intricately carved brass key. She placed the cold metal directly into my palm, her voice dropping to a terrified, conspiratorial whisper. She confessed that Marcus had bragged about hiding his most explosive, unredacted corporate blackmail documents in an unregulated safe deposit box downtown. The physical key sitting in my hand was the only way to access the vault, holding his ultimate destruction, handing me absolute final victory now. The brass key felt like a loaded weapon burning a hole in my tailored blazer as I ordered my driver to the financial district. The unregulated private depository Sarah had described was located deep beneath an imposing pre-war building, heavily favored by old money elites who preferred their transactions completely off the grid. I bypassed the ornate marble lobby and descended a sweeping staircase toward the subterranean vault level, my heels echoing sharply against the polished stone. The air down here was thick, artificially cooled, and smelled faintly of oiled metal and ancient secrets. A strange grinding noise reverberated down the dimly lit corridor, accompanied by muffled, frantic cursing that sounded entirely too familiar. I rounded the corner into the main safety deposit room and stopped dead in my tracks, taking in a scene of absolute pathetic desperation. Marcus was on his knees in front of a wall of reinforced steel boxes, his designer suit jacket discarded on the floor, and his silk tie violently loosened. He was clutching a heavy-duty industrial power drill, sweating profusely as he aggressively attempted to bore straight through the lock of box number 412. The sheer panic radiating from his trembling shoulders confirmed everything Sarah had just told me. He knew his hidden empire was collapsing and he was completely out of time. I leaned casually against the cold steel of the vault doorway, crossing my arms over my chest, and loudly complimented his sudden interest in manual labor. Marcus spun around so fast, he dropped the heavy drill, the metal clattering deafeningly against the marble floor. His eyes were completely bloodshot, wild, and dilated with the terror of a man who had finally run out of inherited privilege to hide behind. He scrambled to his feet, his chest heaving as he stared at the brass key dangling effortlessly from my manicured fingers. He demanded to know how I had acquired it, his voice breaking into a shrill, panicked pitch that echoed ridiculously in the cavernous room. I calmly informed him that his sister was currently organizing a decade's worth of my corporate tax receipts in a basement cubicle, having eagerly traded his ultimate downfall for minimum wage and a temporary reprieve from homelessness. Marcus's face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury, the last remnants of his polished executive persona shattering into pieces right before my very eyes. He stepped aggressively toward me, balling his hands into tight fists, his 6'2" frame looming over me as he attempted to use his physical size to accomplish what his intellect never could. He snarled that I was nothing but a low-class parasite, a worthless nobody who had married into a legacy I did not deserve, threatening to permanently destroy me if I did not hand over the key immediately. I did not take a single step backward, refusing to yield even an inch of ground to a man who had spent our entire marriage trying to make me feel small. I looked him dead in the eyes, unbothered by his posturing, and simply snapped my fingers. The heavy steel door at the end of the corridor instantly swung open, revealing the imposing figure of the bank general manager, a man named Arthur Sterling. No relation to my former husband, but a man who held absolute authority over this subterranean fortress. Arthur did not arrive alone. He was flanked by 4 massive, heavily armed private security contractors. 2 years ago, when Arthur's private commercial lending firm was on the brink of being hostilely taken over by a predatory hedge fund, my forensic accounting team had uncovered the hidden liabilities in the acquiring firm's portfolio, completely saving his legacy from total ruin. He owed me his professional life, and he had been waiting for my signal since the moment I stepped onto the premises. Arthur pointed a sharp, unwavering finger at my former husband, loudly declaring that Marcus was currently attempting a felony breach of a secured vault. Without hesitating for a single second, the security team rushed forward, tackling Marcus directly into the cold marble floor. They pinned his arms painfully behind his back, securing his wrists with heavy zip ties, while he screamed a litany of desperate, pathetic obscenities. I watched with clinical satisfaction as Marcus was forcefully dragged out of the vault by his collar, his expensive leather shoes scraping helplessly against the floor, until his frantic shouting faded into the distant stairwell. The silence that settled over the room was incredibly peaceful. Arthur offered me a polite, deferential bow before retreating to give me absolute privacy. I walked slowly toward box 412, sliding the heavy brass key into the lock. It turned with a satisfying heavy click. I pulled the long metal drawer free and set it carefully onto the viewing table. I expected to find offshore account ledgers, blackmail material on his business partners, or perhaps the hidden deeds to dummy corporations. Instead, sitting perfectly centered in the metal box was a thick manila envelope sealed with dark red wax. I broke the seal and slid out a stack of aging yellowed legal paper bound by a heavy silk ribbon. It was not a corporate blackmail dossier. It was the original, fully notarized last will and testament of Marcus's late grandfather, the true founder of the Sterling fortune. I scanned the heavily embossed pages, my breath catching in my throat, as my eyes traced the incredibly explicit legal directives. The patriarch had despised Joyce's frivolous spending and endless vanity. According to this legally binding document, the entire Sterling family fortune was supposed to be donated in its entirety to a local charity upon his death, completely bypassing Joyce and her children. The realization slammed into me with an incredible force. Joyce had not simply mismanaged her enormous stolen wealth, she had deliberately suppressed this document, actively committing a massive, unforgivable act of probate fraud for well over a solid decade. The sheer audacity of her crime required a moment of absolute stillness to fully comprehend. For years, Joyce had built an impenetrable social fortress, using funds explicitly designated for a children's hospital and a local housing trust, parading around high society while actively defrauding the most vulnerable citizens of our city. The sheer scale of the deception was breathtaking, a masterclass in sociopathic entitlement. I carefully placed the fragile aging pages back into the thick manila envelope, my mind instantly shifting from profound shock to clinical calculated strategy. I did not take the original document directly to the federal authorities immediately. I secured the highly sensitive file in my personal biometric safe at my private residence and waited, knowing instinctively that a financial crime of this particular magnitude demanded an equally spectacular, highly visible public reckoning. I did not have to wait long. Blissfully unaware that her hidden vault had been breached and that her son was currently sitting in a sterile police holding cell facing multiple felony charges, Joyce moved forward with her most desperate delusional maneuver yet. She aggressively organized the annual Sterling Legacy Gala. It was a lavish, over-the-top charity event traditionally hosted every autumn to flaunt the family's philanthropic dominance across the state. This year, however, it was nothing more than a thinly veiled survival tactic. Desperate to suppress the aggressively swirling rumors of total bankruptcy, following her son-in-law's highly publicized federal arrest, she had quietly maxed out her few remaining lines of credit. She resorted to borrowing heavily from predatory private lenders just to rent the main grand ballroom of the historic Plaza Hotel for a single evening. She desperately needed to project an image of untouchable generational prosperity, silently hoping to secure emergency bridge investments from oblivious attendees to somehow stay afloat. I had actually received my formal invitation several weeks ago, delivered as a mocking, petty gesture intended to showcase my permanent exclusion from their glittering inner circle. I formally accepted the invitation without a single trace of hesitation. The night of the massive gala finally arrived, and the crisp, biting autumn air perfectly matched the icy, unwavering resolve pumping steadily through my veins. I arrived at the Plaza Hotel wearing a breathtaking custom-tailored emerald green silk gown that flowed around my body like liquid glass, an architectural masterpiece of sharp, unforgiving lines designed to project absolute authority. I wore absolutely no jewelry, needing no borrowed diamonds or flashy accessories to command the attention of the elite crowd. The grand ballroom was a suffocating, overwhelming display of financial excess, overflowing with towering arrangements of rare white orchids, glittering crystal centerpieces, and hundreds of the city's wealthiest power brokers sipping incredibly expensive vintage champagne. I glided smoothly through the heavy carved mahogany doors, my entrance immediately shifting the atmospheric gravity of the entire room. Nervous, excited whispers rapidly rippled through the tightly packed crowd as I purposely bypassed the formal greeting line, my expression completely unreadable. Joyce was standing near a towering, intricately carved swan ice sculpture, dripping in what I instantly recognized as heavily insured rented pearls. She was aggressively holding court with a small group of influential local politicians desperately trying to project stability. Her aging face tightened into a rigid mask of pure, unadulterated venom the exact moment she finally spotted me moving through the crowd. She quickly plastered on a fake, incredibly strained smile, clearly assuming that I had come to either beg for financial forgiveness or cause a petty, hysterical scene that would successfully validate her false narrative of my emotional instability. I simply offered her a cold, incredibly empty nod and walked straight past her, heading directly toward the main audio-visual control table, discreetly tucked behind the heavy red velvet stage curtains. I casually handed the confused lead technician a highly encrypted black flash drive, offering him a surprisingly generous cash incentive to completely bypass the evening's previously scheduled philanthropic slideshow. He quietly plugged the small device directly into the main presentation server, without asking a single question, his eyes wide as he pocketed the crisp bills. I took my strategic place near the darkened edge of the main stage, waiting patiently in the shadows, as the elegant string quartet slowly faded out and the ballroom lights dramatically dimmed. Joyce confidently stepped up to the glittering crystal podium, her amplified voice echoing loudly through the massive ballroom as she began her grand, deeply self-congratulatory evening toast. She spoke eloquently and passionately about the enduring historic strength of the Sterling family legacy, the sacred duty of managing inherited wealth, and her deep personal commitment to upholding her late father-in-law's brilliant philanthropic vision. The sheer, unadulterated hypocrisy of her carefully scripted words was almost beautiful in its utter delusion. As she grandly raised her crystal champagne flute to toast the prestigious family name, I walked calmly up the carpeted side steps and stepped directly onto the brightly illuminated stage. I did not rush my movements. I did not shout or create a scene. I approached the podium with measured predatory grace and smoothly slipped the silver microphone directly from her suddenly trembling hand. I looked out over the vast sea of incredibly confused, extremely wealthy faces, the hushed silence in the massive room rapidly becoming absolute and deafening. I pressed a small wireless remote concealed in the palm of my hand, and the massive digital projector screen looming directly behind us instantly flared to brilliant life, displaying the undeniable high-resolution forensic scans of the true, unredacted grandfather's will for the entire world to read. I began to slowly read the dense legal text aloud, my voice echoing with terrifying, unyielding clarity across the ballroom, explicitly detailing the complete and total disinheritance of Joyce Sterling and the legally mandated transfer of every single family asset to a local community charity. The impenetrable billionaire facade instantly shattered into a million irreparable pieces, brutally exposing the reigning arrogant matriarch of high society as absolutely nothing more than a desperate, entirely penniless and broken fraud. The deafening silence inside the grand ballroom lasted for only a fraction of a second before erupting into a chaotic symphony of shocked gasps and frantic whispers. Wealthy socialites and influential politicians raised their glowing smartphones, rapidly snapping photographs of the damning legal documents illuminating the massive projector screen. Joyce stood frozen behind the crystal podium, her jaw slack and her meticulously powdered face draining of all color as she stared at the irrefutable proof of her deception spanning over a decade. I did not step down. I simply pressed the small remote in my palm one more time, seamlessly switching the digital display from the authentic will to a live security feed of the sprawling family estate. The entire audience watched in real time as heavy commercial moving trucks violently breached the tall iron gates of the massive mansion. Swarms of state-appointed liquidators and aggressive repossession agents flooded the manicured grounds, immediately attaching heavy steel tow chains to the fleet of luxury vehicles parked in the circular driveway. The crowd gasped again as a massive flatbed truck dragged the prized custom-ordered car out of the frame, treating the million-dollar automobile like absolute garbage. The digital humiliation broadcasting on the screen was only the opening act of her total destruction. The heavy mahogany doors at the back of the hotel ballroom suddenly swung open with a violent crash, instantly drawing the attention of every single guest in the room. A highly coordinated team of aggressive suit-clad collection agents marched directly onto the pristine carpet, completely ignoring the frantic protests of the hotel security staff. The lead agent marched straight up to the main stage, holding a thick stack of court-ordered asset seizure warrants. He loudly announced to the entire room that every single piece of expensive artwork decorating the gala walls, along with the towering floral arrangements and the crystal centerpieces, had been procured through fraudulent lines of credit. On his immediate command, workers began physically stripping the ballroom bare right in front of the stunned elite society crowd. Men in heavy work boots aggressively unhooked rented paintings from the silk-lined walls, hastily wrapping them in cheap industrial moving blankets. Another agent approached Joyce, directly brandishing a pair of heavy wire clippers. He coldly informed her that the magnificent draped pearls around her neck were stolen collateral from a local jeweler who wanted them back immediately. Joyce stumbled backward, clutching her chest, as a female agent aggressively unclasped the heavy pearls from her neck and dropped them unceremoniously into a plastic evidence bag. The once untouchable matriarch of the family empire suddenly looked like a terrified, helpless child. She frantically turned to the wealthy politicians and influential power brokers who had been drinking her expensive champagne just moments earlier. She practically lunged at a prominent state senator, grasping the sleeve of his tailored tuxedo, hysterically begging for a temporary bridge loan to stop the public humiliation. The senator physically recoiled violently, ripping his arm from her grasp with a look of absolute unvarnished disgust before turning his back on her entirely. Joyce fell heavily to her knees, her emerald silk gown pooling around her on the stage floor, as she crawled toward a billionaire real estate developer she had known for 30 years. She sobbed uncontrollably, pleading for mercy, offering him imaginary stakes in non-existent offshore companies if he would just write her a check. The developer simply sneered, signaling his private security detail to clear a path toward the exit. One by one, the elite guests turned away from her pathetic groveling display, their expressions shifting from shock to pure revulsion as they abandoned the ruined matriarch to her fate. The crowd parted abruptly near the main entrance as a new frantic commotion broke out. Marcus burst through the remaining guests, his expensive designer suit heavily wrinkled and completely saturated with nervous sweat. He had apparently just posted an exorbitant emergency bail, following his humiliating arrest at the bank vault, rushing straight to the gala in a desperate, delusional attempt to salvage his crumbling reputation. His eyes darted wildly around the half-stripped ballroom, taking in the repossession agents hauling away rented sculptures and his mother weeping hysterically on the floor. He locked eyes with me, standing calmly on the stage, his face contorting into a mask of pure, irrational rage. He opened his mouth to shout something undoubtedly vile, preparing to launch into another pathetic display of physical intimidation. Before he could even take a single aggressive step in my direction, a sharp, echoing crack instantly silenced the murmuring crowd. Chloe, his young, beautiful mistress, had stepped out from the shadows of the coat check area, her face contorting with absolute fury. She did not look at him with the adoring, submissive gaze he was so accustomed to demanding. Instead, she had just delivered a vicious, open-handed slap, directly across his jaw, the sound reverberating sharply through the cavernous room. Marcus staggered abruptly backward, a red handprint blooming across his pale cheek. He stared at his mistress in absolute shock, raising a trembling hand to his face as he stammered her name. Chloe offered no words of comfort, nor did she shed a tear for the man who had promised her the world. She reached into her sleek clutch and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents, slamming them aggressively into his chest. As the papers scattered across the marble floor, she loudly announced to the room that she was suing him for severe financial fraud and identity theft. She fiercely revealed that Marcus had secretly used her social security number and forged her signature to establish his illegal international shell companies, cowardly attempting to frame her for his federal wire fraud. She sneered down at his pathetic, trembling form, declaring that she had already turned over every single one of his incriminating text messages, private emails, and burner phones to the federal prosecutors in exchange for total legal immunity. The sharp clatter of Chloe's stilettos fading down the marble corridor signaled the absolute final end of Marcus Sterling. I did not stay to watch him scramble on his hands and knees to collect the scattered pages of his impending federal indictment. I left the ruined ballroom, stepping into the crisp air to return to my headquarters. The city was quiet at 3 a.m, but the upper floors of my building were alive with the hum of international markets. I sat behind my obsidian desk, reviewing the final asset transfer protocols that would insulate my companies from the Sterling family's radioactive fallout. The silence of my suite was absolute, a perfect reflection of the impenetrable empire I had built. That tranquility shattered when the glass doors of my outer office cracked open with a sickening crunch of bypassed security locks. Marcus stumbled into my sanctum, looking less like a titan of industry and more like a starving animal. His suit was ripped at the shoulder, reeking of cheap scotch and sweat. He had bypassed the security desk by smashing a fire exit window, leaving bloody handprints across my pristine carpeting. He slammed his fists onto my desk, his bloodshot eyes wide with a terrifying, unhinged desperation. He did not ask for forgiveness, nor did he offer a single word of remorse for the psychological abuse he had subjected me to. Instead, he demanded capital. He screamed that I owed him a fresh start, insisting he needed an untraceable wire transfer of $5 million to flee the country before federal prosecutors froze his passport. He pounded the glass surface wildly, declaring he was a brilliant self-made visionary who just needed a fraction of my wealth to rebuild his empire from the ashes. I did not flinch, nor did I reach for the brass paperweight sitting inches from my hand. I remained still, leaning back in my leather chair, and fixed him with a stare of clinical disgust. I opened the top drawer and retrieved a slim manila folder, tossing it casually onto the center of the desk. I informed Marcus that I had spent the last 5 years auditing every single one of his personal and professional ledgers. I did not yell. I began reciting the exact mathematical equations of his total incompetence. I read aloud the staggering multi-million-dollar losses he had incurred on his vanity projects, losses that Joyce had illegally covered using stolen charity funds to protect his fragile ego. I detailed the catastrophic failure rates of his shell companies, proving logically that he had never generated a single cent of actual profit in his entire life. He tried to interrupt, his face turning crimson, but I cut him off with a sharp command, my voice slicing through his hysterical rambling. I pulled out a spreadsheet and pointed to the highlighted red columns. I mathematically proved that he was entirely dependent on a financial ecosystem built on fraud, nepotism, and female labor. I reminded him that I was the one who corrected his disastrous tax filings, structured his corporate expansions, and managed his chaotic portfolios, while he spent nights in luxury hotel suites with women like Chloe. I dismantled the myth of his entrepreneurial genius, reducing his entire existence to a cold, negative integer. I looked him in the eye and told him he was never a self-made man. He was simply a bloated parasite who had finally run out of hosts to bleed dry. Marcus let out a guttural roar, his hands reaching across the desk to grab me by the throat. He lunged forward, knocking the computer monitor to the floor in a blind rage. I did not move a muscle to defend myself. I raised my right hand and pointed a manicured finger toward the small blinking red light positioned discreetly beneath the lip of my desk. The flashing crimson bulb illuminated the dark corner of the room, silently broadcasting its deadly purpose. I informed him, my voice steady, that I had triggered the silent emergency alarm the exact second his bloody hand breached my office door. I had kept him talking, breaking his spirit solely to run out the clock. The heavy oak doors of my suite exploded inward before Marcus could process the flashing light. A heavily armed tactical unit from the city police department stormed into the room, their boots thundering against the floorboards. Before Marcus could turn or raise his hands, 3 massive officers tackled him to the ground. His face smashed against the polished hardwood, his nose cracking audibly as they forcefully pinned his arms behind his back. He screamed in pain and terror, spitting blood onto my rug as the steel handcuffs clicked tightly around his wrists. The commanding officer read him his Miranda rights, rapidly listing off the federal charges of wire fraud, identity theft, and corporate espionage that Chloe had so graciously provided the evidence for earlier that evening. As the officers hoisted his limp body off the floor, preparing to drag him out into the waiting squad cars, I stood up from my desk. I picked up a heavily embossed legal document, printed on premium ivory paper. I walked slowly around the desk, stopping just inches from his bruised and weeping face. I held the document up to his eye level, forcing him to read the finalized signatures at the bottom of the page. It was our expedited, court-approved divorce decree, signed and sealed by a judge who had reviewed the extensive evidence of his financial crimes. I informed him that under the severability clauses of our prenuptial agreement, triggered instantly by his documented felony fraud, he was entitled to absolutely nothing. No alimony, no property, no hidden assets. He was leaving this marriage exactly as he had entered it, a hollow, worthless fraud. I dropped the heavy decree directly onto his chest, watching it flutter to the floor as the officers dragged him away into the suffocating darkness of his own making. The suffocating darkness that swallowed my former husband was merely the prelude to the violent storm that washed away the remnants of the Sterling Empire. The spectacular public repossession of the sprawling Sterling mansion had been a chaotic, highly televised spectacle that left Joyce utterly destitute. She had been forcibly evicted from her generational fortress while still wearing her emerald gala gown, forced to watch helplessly as aggressive federal agents cataloged her stolen artwork and chained her luxury vehicles to industrial tow trucks. By the time the relentless midnight thunderstorm rolled across the city, plunging the wealthy suburbs into a cold, unforgiving downpour, she had completely exhausted her list of powerful allies. Every single one of her high society friends, church board members, and political beneficiaries had permanently blocked her number, terrified of being legally implicated in her massive philanthropic fraud. The absolute isolation she had designed for me had finally become her own inescapable reality. The relentless rain was pounding heavily against the reinforced glass of my private residence. My children were safely asleep upstairs, shielded from the toxic fallout of their father's federal indictment. The advanced security perimeter of my newly constructed estate was absolute a physical manifestation of the ironclad boundaries I had forged from years of enduring their relentless psychological warfare. At precisely 2 in the morning, the high-definition intercom on my kitchen island flared to brilliant life with a sharp, insistent chime. I tapped the glowing digital screen, instantly bringing up the night vision feed from the primary entry gate. Standing in the torrential downpour, shivering uncontrollably beneath the towering wrought iron spikes, was Joyce. She possessed no umbrella, no chauffeured vehicle, and absolutely none of the arrogant entitlement that had defined her entire miserable existence. The state liquidators had clearly been exceptionally thorough, stripping her of everything right down to her dignity. I pulled a heavy waterproof wool trench coat over my shoulders, grabbed a large black umbrella, and walked slowly down the sweeping, manicured driveway. The freezing rain battered the dark canopy above me, but I remained perfectly warm and entirely untouchable. I stopped exactly 2 feet from the imposing gate, making absolutely no move to deactivate the magnetic lock. Joyce gripped the cold metal bars with trembling, wrinkled hands. Her expensive salon blowout was plastered flat against her skull, and her premium mascara ran down her pale cheeks in dark, muddy rivers. The sheer undeniable irony of her standing on the outside of a locked gate, begging for entry into the world of a woman she had spent over a decade actively trying to destroy, was a masterpiece of poetic justice. She immediately launched into a highly calculated, utterly pathetic performance. Her voice cracked with manufactured sorrow as she pleaded for a momentary reprieve from the freezing storm. She aggressively attempted to rewrite history right there in the rain, crying out that she had been completely blindsided by her late husband's financial crimes and manipulated by her own son's greed. She swore she had always loved me like a true daughter, claiming that her harsh criticisms were simply misguided attempts to prepare me for the ruthless reality of high society. When she realized her fabricated victim narrative was bouncing harmlessly off my unyielding stare, she desperately pivoted to her final, most manipulative tactic. She begged to see her grandchildren. She sobbed that she had lost everything, that her reputation was in ashes. Her prestigious church group had publicly excommunicated her, and those children were the only innocent things left in her shattered life. She promised she just wanted to hold them one last time before facing the federal prosecutors. I did not blink. I stared at the pathetic, shivering woman clinging to my gate and felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no pity, no vindictive joy. Just a profound, clinical emptiness. I calmly informed her that my children were not emotional life rafts for her to cling to after deliberately sinking her own ship. I reminded her that she had spent their entire lives treating them as secondary citizens, actively favoring her pure-blooded sterling grandchildren, while treating mine as unfortunate genetic accidents. I explicitly detailed how she had used stolen charity funds to host lavish birthday parties for her preferred heirs, while conveniently ignoring my children's existence. Her sobbing hitched a flash of genuine venomous hatred, briefly breaking through her fragile mask of remorse, before she forced the fake tears to flow again. She gripped the bars tighter, her knuckles turning stark white, and shrieked that I was a cruel, heartless monster punishing an old woman for mistakes she could not control. I remained perfectly still, letting her hysterical screams echo uselessly into the stormy night. When her voice finally grew hoarse and her frantic pounding slowed, I reached into the deep pocket of my trench coat. I pulled out a small, heavy cream envelope sealed with a simple wax stamp. I stepped forward and slid the envelope smoothly through a narrow gap in the iron bars. Joyce gasped, snatching the paper with terrifying animalistic speed. Her dilated eyes widened with a sudden desperate hope, clearly expecting to find a cashier's check for a luxury hotel stay, the deed to a small condo, or perhaps the contact information for a high-powered defense attorney. She ripped the heavy paper open with her teeth, her wet fingers fumbling eagerly inside. She pulled out a single crisp $100 bill and a standard economy class bus ticket valid for a one-way trip to a dilapidated rural county 3 states away. The color completely drained from her face as she stared blankly at the meager offering. She looked up at me, her mouth opening and closing in stunned, silent outrage. I looked her dead in the eye, my voice cutting through the heavy rain with lethal surgical precision. I reminded her of a cold, rainy evening exactly 12 years ago, long before I had built my empire. I had stood in her opulent foyer holding my acceptance letter to a prestigious university, asking for a temporary co-signer on a student loan because my working-class parents had exhausted their savings buying my textbooks. I reminded her how she had laughed in my face, handed my parents a single $100 bill, and told them to buy me a bus ticket back to my hometown because girls from my social class did not belong in Ivy League institutions. I told her that the Sterling family might be comfortable stealing from charities and hiding behind fraudulent wills, but I was a woman who always, without exception, paid her debts in full. The realization of her absolute defeat finally shattered her completely. Joyce crushed the bus ticket in her fist and let out a piercing guttural scream of pure, unadulterated rage. She hurled vile, desperate obscenities into the night, rattling the unmoving iron gate with all her remaining strength. I simply turned my back on her screaming form, the heavy click of my boots entirely drowning out her frantic curses. I walked calmly back up my brightly lit driveway, returning to the absolute warmth and security of my home. Behind me, the screaming eventually faded into a ragged, pathetic whimper. With absolutely nowhere else to go, and the freezing rain chilling her to the bone, Joyce finally turned her back on the locked gate and began the long, humiliating trudge down the dark, flooded street toward the public bus stop. The storm that washed the Sterling name into the gutters broke, giving way to a crisp dawn that illuminated their ruin. The subsequent weeks moved with a relentless velocity, a fast-paced montage of absolute destruction for a family that once believed themselves untouchable. Federal prosecutors offered no plea deals or quiet settlements. The mountain of irrefutable forensic evidence I compiled left defense attorneys with no room to maneuver, turning highly publicized trials into swift, merciless executions of justice. Marcus was processed through the penal system with dizzying speed, completely stripped of tailored Italian suits, his arrogant smirk, and the shield of stolen generational wealth. He was relocated to a maximum security penitentiary, upstate, a grim concrete fortress, where his inherited superiority held zero currency. His days of sipping vintage scotch in corner offices were permanently replaced by the harsh fluorescent glare of the prison block. I received occasional updates from prosecuting attorneys painting a vivid picture of his new reality. Marcus, the former titan of industry, now wore a drab, ill-fitting orange jumpsuit, spending mandated labor hours on his hands and knees scrubbing the filthy linoleum floors of the communal cafeteria. Industrial bleach cracked the skin on his hands, a stinging reminder of the pampered life he arrogantly threw away. He was a number in a system that did not care about his name, surrounded by hardened men who despised his cowardice. Stripped of his stolen money, he was instantly reduced to the bottom, terrified and completely broken. His mother fared no better in the unforgiving landscape of the real world. Joyce's spectacular eviction from the Sterling mansion left her with absolutely nothing but her wet clothes and the bus ticket I slid through the iron gates. She was forced to relocate to a damp studio apartment in a decaying neighborhood she would have once bypassed entirely. Predatory lenders she relied on to fund her desperate gala aggressively seized her few remaining personal assets, liquidating her designer wardrobe and hidden jewelry to cover massive debts. To avoid starvation, the former queen of the city's philanthropic elite was forced to accept a grueling minimum wage position at a grease-stained 24-hour diner on the outskirts of town. Joyce spent her nights wearing a stiff polyester uniform, her aching feet crammed into cheap slip-resistant shoes as she carried heavy trays of burnt coffee and greasy eggs to exhausted truck drivers. The harsh reality of physical labor ravaged her aging body. Her manicured nails chipped and split from harsh dishwashing detergents, and the thick smell of stale frying oil permanently clung to her hair. Occasionally, patrons who recognized her from the society pages would whisper and point, leaving meager, insulting tips just to watch her force a painfully humiliating, subservient smile. There was no escape from the relentless poverty she had actively inflicted upon so many others for over a decade. Sarah, the only Sterling who possessed enough basic survival instinct to recognize defeat, quietly accepted her mandated reality. She arrived at my corporate headquarters promptly at 6 every morning, keeping her head down and her mouth firmly shut. Stripped of unearned executive titles, she was relegated to a small, windowless basement cubicle tasked with manually sorting and filing thousands of dense, dusty archival tax receipts. She took mandated 15-minute lunch breaks in silence, fully aware that her continued employment and her survival depended entirely on my ongoing mercy. I never gloated or visited her in the archives. Simply knowing she was there, humbly earning an honest wage for the first time in her life, was completely sufficient. Far above the basement, bathed in the brilliant sunlight of the 60th floor, I sat comfortably behind the massive obsidian desk in my corner CEO office. The sheer scale of the room commanded absolute authority, featuring panoramic windows that offered an unbroken view of the bustling city skyline below. The chaotic noise of the streets could not penetrate the thick, soundproofed glass, leaving the suite in a state of perfect tranquility. On a plush white rug near the center of the expansive room, my twins played happily with a set of wooden building blocks. Their bright laughter echoed softly through the office, safely untainted by the toxic manipulation and calculated cruelty that once threatened them. The heavy glass door to my suite clicked open, and my executive assistant stepped aside to usher in a scheduled appointment. The man who walked across the polished hardwood floor was not a client seeking standard portfolio management. It was the Honorable Judge Harrison, the exact same stern, uncompromising magistrate who presided over my harrowing custody battle just months prior. He did not look at me with the adversarial glare he had worn on the bench when Marcus was spinning his web of lies. Instead, he approached my desk with a posture of deep, undeniable respect. He extended a firm hand, formally greeting me not as a desperate mother, but as an undeniable titan. He took a seat in one of the leather chairs opposite my desk. He explained that my surgical dismantling of the Sterling family's massive charitable fraud network had sent shockwaves through the highest levels of the state government. The flawless forensic evidence I provided to federal prosecutors exposed several systemic loopholes that local politicians had been exploiting for years. He had come to me directly, bypassing standard channels, to formally request that the state hire my private forensic accounting firm on an exclusive retainer. He wanted my team to aggressively track down, audit, and dismantle the hidden financial networks of several deeply corrupt political figures who had operated with absolute impunity for decades. I leaned back, steepled my fingers, and looked at the powerful judge seeking my expertise. I glanced down at my twins, safe and secure. I methodically balanced the sterling fortune to absolute zero. But looking out over the city skyline, I knew my own worth, both financial and personal, was truly infinite. I smiled and extended my hand to accept the lucrative contract.